Good afternoon and welcome to the Angry Astronaut. To the surprise, I think, of just about nobody, we have a lawsuit in progress in regards to Starship. Although, it's kind of interesting as to who is being sued right now. That may have surprised a few people. It actually kind of surprised me, at least at first. But the reasons are now becoming very obvious. First of all, who's involved in the lawsuit? Well, there are 4 different environmental organizations, one of which has very deep pockets and lots of lobbyists in Washington, and a Native American tribe as well who have been involved in trying to stop Starship testing for quite some time. So a pretty powerful alliance of organizations, again with deep pockets and lots of attorneys. So why are they issuing the lawsuit? Well, that's pretty obvious. Starship caused a lot more damage to the area than was anticipated, more than even the FAA documentation, the PEA that is stated would happen in the event of a full-fledged anomaly, that is to say, a Starship explosion. That's right, the PEA only anticipated that the explosion would affect an area of roughly 700 acres in size if there were an explosion. Starship did not explode, but debris was thrown as far as the Gulf of Mexico into the ocean, which was beyond the test area. That being the case, then, the PEA did not properly anticipate the damage that would happen and the widespread impact of the debris. Now, of course, the debris is mostly just concrete and dust, nothing really toxic, at least as far as we know, and also as far as we know, no animals were actually harmed during the test. But that doesn't mean that these organizations don't have a case. And why are they suing the FAA instead of SpaceX? Well, there are a number of reasons, but one in particular stands out to me. And frankly, I think it's going to give them a very good chance of getting what they want. And what do they want? Well, it's not just to stop Starship completely. Instead, they just want to delay it long enough to where Elon gives up on Boca Chica. For those of us who were concerned about the fact that Starship didn't have proper launch facilities, especially a flame trench, prior to the liftoff of the most powerful rocket in the history of mankind, this was the most dangerous time for the craft. The time when Starship was ripping up debris and could potentially cause enough damage to the rocket to where it could explode either on the pad or even worse, a couple of 100 meters off the pad. Had something like this happened, this lawsuit would be a lot more significant and might involve lots of local communities in addition to all of these environmental groups. But let's be honest with ourselves for a moment. These environmental groups would have sued regardless of what happened during Starship's launch. They've been so implacably opposed to Starship using Boca Chica for a launch facility that they would have taken legal action no matter what. The question is, do they have a case, and why are they suing the FAA? Well, the reason they're suing the FAA, in my opinion, is pretty obvious. If they sue a federal government organization, that means Texas judges are not going to be making the decisions over this. Texas judges are generally supportive of anything that brings business to Texas. There aren't a lot of judges in Texas who are going to file any sort of injunctions that threaten to take millions of dollars of business, or in this case, billions of dollars of business, out of the state. Texas judges in general tend to be conservative and favor business over the environment. Now, of course, this isn't always the case. I don't want to stereotype anybody, but overall, Texas judges are more likely to protect SpaceX rather than support the efforts of these environmental organizations. Now that the entire lawsuit has been exported to Washington, D.C. and to federal judges there, it changes everything. Now, keep in mind, this is not an injunction to stop future launches. Regardless of what happens during this lawsuit, in theory, the FAA could just keep pushing forward, award another launch license to SpaceX while the case is taking place, and push forward come hell or high water. They're not going to do that, though, and I'm going to explain why. And I think the best way to explain all of this is to take you through the first few paragraphs of this lawsuit and explain why these folks may actually have a fairly decent case. Paragraph 1. This case concerns whether the nation's commitment to preserving our critical wildlife habitat and treasured coastal landscapes must be sacrificed as we reach out to explore the cosmos. It is also about whether regulators will hold powerful corporations accountable or allow them to disregard environmental laws simply because of their political and financial influence. Paragraph 2. Here, the FAA, which has federal authority over the launching of vehicles into space, has authorized the SpaceX Starship Super Heavy launch vehicle program at Boca Chica without complying with bedrock federal environmental law, without fully analyzing the significant environmental and community impacts of the SpaceX launch program, including destruction of some of the most vital migratory bird habitat in North America, and without requiring mitigation sufficient to offset those impacts. So here's the problem. In general, nothing in any of these paragraphs is fundamentally untrue. The FAA pushed forward without a full-fledged environmental impact statement at Boca Chica. Now, an environmental impact statement was put together back in 2014 when SpaceX was planning to use the facility for Falcon Heavy and Falcon 9 launches, but nothing was included for Starship. A new environmental impact statement would have taken a tremendous amount of time, and so an environmental assessment was carried out instead. An environmental assessment is only appropriate if the environmental assessment finds that there's going to be no significant impact on the environment. And here's the problem. The PEA spelled out that at worst, a 700-acre area would be impacted by a full-fledged Starship anomaly. In other words, the rocket exploding. The rocket didn't explode, and yet the impact drifted far beyond that 700-acre region, as I said before, chucking lots of debris into the Gulf of Mexico. It is now very difficult for the FAA to argue that Starship is going to have no significant impact on the surrounding area, especially if an anomaly were to take place sometime in the future. The proof is in the results, and this being the case, it gives these organizations a very strong case against the FAA in their overall argument that the FAA should have carried out an environmental impact statement as opposed to an environmental assessment. And if the FAA allows SpaceX to proceed with another launch license before the case is completed, well, that serves to strengthen the plaintiff's arguments. Now let's move on to paragraph 5. Quote, SpaceX undertook the first launch of the Starship Super Heavy rocket on April 20th, 2023. Just minutes into the launch, the rocket exploded. Furthermore, the launch pad was destroyed, scattering debris and ash over a large area, including lands that provide habitat for endangered species. FAA has not announced any plans to initiate a supplemental review process pursuant to NEPA, That stands, by the way, for the National Environmental Policy Act, to consider the human health and environmental impacts associated with the explosion, including reports of sand, ash, and concrete being blown up to several miles away and outside the area that FAA had previously considered. So what the plaintiffs are arguing here is that the FAA is required under current law to institute a process that will eventually require the FAA to issue an environmental impact statement, a process that will take at least 1 to 2 years. This is something, of course, that Elon can't afford to wait for, and this is something that's going to compel Elon to move Starship operations from Boca Chica to someplace else, probably Cape Canaveral. But even if he decides to do this, it's going to delay the program for at least another 6 months to a year, because obviously NASA is not going to allow this damaging rocket to take off from their facilities until SpaceX can prove that they've built the necessary facilities at Cape Canaveral to protect the surrounding area against a similar incident from occurring. And the current facilities that SpaceX has constructed at the Cape are not sufficient. They're going to have to redesign what they have out there, and all of that is going to take a substantial amount of time as well. So essentially, this lawsuit is arguing that the PEA is insufficient, that the PEA does not properly account for all the damage that Starship could potentially do to this sensitive region, and that the FAA needs to proceed with a more in-depth environmental report. That being the case, then, it's just going to delay everything at Boca Chica by a considerable amount of time, and if the FAA were simply to plunge forward while the case was still in process, that would just strengthen the plaintiffs' arguments. The FAA cannot afford to take that kind of chance, because if the FAA were to lose this case, it creates a very damaging legal precedent that essentially says that the FAA is not properly equipped and not unbiased enough to carry out these kinds of assessments, that they are not the proper agency to license future rocket launches, and that somebody else needs to handle this. That would be very, very damaging to the FAA's authority and to their reputation, something that they dare not risk. That being the case, then, I don't see the FAA granting SpaceX a launch license for a considerable amount of time, at least until they get a proper handle on this lawsuit, consult with their attorneys, and determine just how likely they are to win this suit in the long run. And in the meantime, the Center for Biological Diversity, the American Bird Conservancy, the Surfrider Foundation, Save RGV, and the Carrizo Comrecrudo Nation of Texas, well, all of these plaintiffs got an enormous gift granted to them on April 20th, just as I was concerned they might. I said many times that these organizations were just praying for something like this to happen, itching to take action if the Starship launch didn't go absolutely perfectly. And even though the rocket performed very well, and I'm actually very convinced that the rocket would have performed much, much better if it hadn't taken so much damage during this concrete tornado, as Elon described it, well, none of that is really going to matter. And as I have said before, if an idiot like me could anticipate that the way the pad was set up, the lack of a flame trench, was as problematic as I thought it might be, if somebody like me could see that, and also many others besides me, by the way, why the hell couldn't SpaceX see it? And if a water-cooled flame diverter could have made a big difference, well, impatience may have cost SpaceX, and especially Artemis, a great deal. So why have I been so angry about this? Why am I so frustrated with SpaceX? Why do I spout such negativity, as a lot of people accuse me of? Well, I want Starship to succeed. I think Starship can bring about some amazing changes, not only to spaceflight, but to human civilization in general. Indeed, for environmentalists, this can accomplish everything that they want. If we have the ability to export mining, heavy industry, etc., off of our planet, then we can remove the damaging impacts of all of these activities. Mining industry that causes so much damage to the environment, far more than 100 Starship launch facilities could possibly cause. But you can't carry out heavy-duty industrial activity in space, and you can't mine in space without a big reusable spacecraft like Starship. And obviously, what's happened now is going to delay the implementation of Starship and everything that it can bring to the human race. So many positive things that Starship could bring to us, and now it's going to take a lot longer to get it moving forward. That is very, very unfortunate, especially when you consider that all of this was avoidable. Many, many people, including myself, were warning SpaceX publicly about the dangers of trying to take off with such a powerful rocket on a pad that wasn't properly prepared for it. I'm not going to go through all the reasons again. I think you guys have seen enough of my content to know where I'm coming from here. They could have, at the very least, have put that water-cooled plate in place and everything that was necessary to keep it operating. They could have done all of those things prior to launch. If it had taken another 2 or 3 months to get Starship off the ground, big deal. Because I'm telling you right now, it's going to take a whole lot longer than that before Starship gets a second shot at getting to orbit. Smash that like, hit that subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. Also, please hit those notification bells and check the description for various ways to continue supporting my content. And as always, stay angry about space.